Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about simple interest. Our content objective is students will be able to solve problems involving simple interest. Language objective is students will be able to explain in words the process of solving problems involving simple interest. And why am I learning this? Well, it's important for many real-life problems like calculating how much money in interest the bank will pay you. So if someone borrows money from a bank, what factors influence how much is paid back? Well, it depends on how much you borrow. It depends on how long you borrow it. And it kind of depends on what interest they charge you for borrowing that money. Now, the same is going to be true for depositing money as well in your account. So when you put your money into account, they also consider how much you're putting in the bank, how long you're keeping it in the bank, and the interest rate that they're going to provide you for banking with them. So, the first word that we're going to go over is principal. Principal is basically how much was borrowed, or in terms of a savings account maybe, we can think of it in terms of how much is deposited into your account. Now, time is definitely a factor. Time is obviously how long it's borrowed for, specifically in years typically. And rate would be, well, what interest were you charged? This is the case if you're borrowing money. Now, if you were keeping money into a bank account in your savings, then you would consider their annual rate. So simple interest is money paid only on the principal. So whatever you borrowed or whatever that's deposited. So let's take a look at our first example. It says Joe borrows $200 from the bank at 6% simple interest for 3 years. How much interest does he owe? How much money does he now owe? So one way you can set it up is using a proportion. We're going to set it up as the percent over 100 and the amount of change, which is the interest owed or earned over the original amount, which we are going to consider the principal. Now, this is specifically going to work for 1 year. So our percent is 6%, so I'm going to go ahead and put 6 over 100. Now, we don't know the interest yet. That's what we're calculating, but we do know the original amount, aka the principal, so we're going to go ahead and write it over 200. So this is how you would set it up if you were using a proportion. Now, my focus is mainly on using the equation y equals kx, where y is the amount of change, k, of course, is the percent after the change, and x is your original amount. Well, as of right now, the only thing I do know is the percent of change as well as the original amount. So for that, my percent is 6%, and the original amount, in this case, how much you borrowed, which is the principal, is 200. So when you calculate this, 600 times 200 will give you 12. So what does this mean? This is just interest. Okay, so in 1 year, he's going to be charged $12 of interest, but we're not looking at just 1 year. Joe is apparently borrowing it for 3 years. So what would that be? Well, it's times 3, so we're going to go ahead and say that he's going to owe $36 in interest alone. Now, that answers part of the question because it says how much interest does he owe? So I would say Joe owes $36 in interest. But the next question is how much money does he now owe? Let's not forget that he originally borrowed $200, so he definitely needs to pay that back. So not only does he owe $36 in interest, he also owes the $200 he originally borrowed. So I would say altogether he's going to owe $236. Okay, looking at another example, it says Juan invests $5,000 in bonds for 6 years at an annual interest rate of 7%. How much interest did he earn? How much is the bond now worth? So again, we can set it up as a proportion. Percent over 100 equals the amount of change, aka interest owed or earned, over the original amount, which we're going to consider the principal. So here we're going to go ahead and set it up as 7% over 100. I don't know the interest at the moment, but I do know the principal, which is the original amount, which is $5,000. So this is how you would set it up as a proportion. But as you may know, I do want to stress the equation more than the proportion. So how do we set up this one? Well, let's remember y represents the amount of change, y represents the percent after the change, and x represents the amount before the change. So x you can refer to as the original price or amount, which in this case was the $5,000. Then of course we know the percent of change is the 7% that was provided. So here I'm going to say y equals 700 times 5,000 is 350. So what does this mean? Well, this is just interest in 1 year, but they want to know how much it's going to be in 6 years. To figure out how much it's going to cost in 6 years, I'm going to multiply this by 6, which is going to give me a grand total of $2,100. So for those of you who may not know, a bond is basically money that the government is borrowing from an individual. As an individual, if you buy a bond, you will earn some interest that the government will pay. So in this case, how much interest did he earn? He earned $2,100 in just interest. So this is extra money that he's earning on top of the $5,000 he's going to get back. So if they ask on how much interest did he earn, I would say Juan earned $2,100 in interest. But the next question is, how much is the bond now worth? Well, originally the bond was $5,000, but with the interest of $2,100, the bond is now currently worth $7,100. Number 3, why don't you go ahead and pause the video and try this one by yourself. So for number 3, it says Grace borrowed $3,500 to be repaid after 5 years at an annual simple interest rate of 8%. How much interest will she be paying? So again, we can set it up as a proportion. In this case, we would go ahead and write 8% over 100. The amount of change, which is the interest, I don't know, so I'm going to go ahead and call that N. But I do know the original amount, which is the principal, so that's going to be the $3,500 that Grace borrowed. So this is how you would set it up as a proportion, but once again, hopefully you know that my stress is going to be more on the equation. So let's take a look at that. So once again, we're going to go ahead and plug in what we know. We don't know the amount of change yet, but we do know the percent of change. We're going to say the percent of change is 8%. Okay, and if you need a reminder, you're simply putting the decimal at the end because that's where the decimal belongs for a whole number. And we're going to move the decimal 2 places to the left, and that's how I got 0.08 if you're curious. Now, I also do know the original amount, which is the principal, which is $3,500. So this is how you would set up your equation. So what does that give us? Well, when you multiply these two numbers together, we are going to get $280. What does that mean? Well, that means Grace is going to owe $280 in interest in 1 year. But it does state that she's borrowing this for 5 years. So I need to calculate, well, if in 1 year it's 280, in 5 years it's going to be 5 times that. So that's going to be a total of $1,400. So if you're wondering how I got that, I just basically took 280 and multiplied that by the 5 years. Okay, so here's the thing. That's all that they asked. They said, how much interest will she be paying? So since that's all they're asking me, I'm going to say Grace will pay $1,400 in interest for 5 years. Number 4, it says Paige deposited $1,500 in a savings account. How much will she have in the account after 3 years at an annual simple interest rate of 4%? Assume she does not make any more deposits or withdrawals. So why don't you go ahead and pause the video and try this one by yourself. Okay, so let's see how well you did. For number 4, you can set up a proportion. It would have been 4 over 100 equals n over 1,500. Or you can set it up using an equation. Hopefully you set it up as y equals the 4% times the principal, which was 1,500. So if you're wondering what a principal is, remember it's basically how much you either borrowed or how much you deposit. So in this case, since Paige deposited 1,500, that is the principal. Now if you calculate this, this is going to give us the interest. What this means is that she earns $60 of interest in 1 year. So how much would she make in 3 years though? Well, that means she's going to earn 3 times as much. So I'm just going to multiply 60 times 3, which is going to give her a grand total of $180. So that's how much she earned in 3 years. But if we go back to the question, it says how much will she have in the account after 3 years at an annual simple interest rate of 4%. So yes, she's going to earn an additional $180, but let's not forget the money she already deposited. She deposited $1,500. So we're going to consider that that's the money she has, and we're going to go ahead and add on top of that the $180 of interest that she earned for those 3 years, which would give her a grand total of $1,680. Okay, so from earlier, the factors that influence interest paid or earned was the principal, the time, and the rate. So remember, interest rate is basically money paid only on the principal. So if Jalen borrows $500 from the bank at a 3% simple interest and pays $90 worth of interest, for how many years did she borrow? So how would we solve something like this? Well, we're going to use an equation. So write this in your notes. It's basically simple interest is the principal times the rate, but also times the time. So this can also be known as the I equals P times R times T. I standing for interest, P for principal, R for rate, and T for time. So what information do I know? Do I know how much interest was earned? The answer was yes, it was $90 worth of interest. Do I know the principal? Yes, $500 was borrowed, so that's P. So this is interest, this is principal. Do I know the rate? Yes, the rate was at 3%, so I'm going to go ahead and write that as 0.03. And let's put this as a times like this so it doesn't look confusing. And let's see, do we know the time? The answer is no. In fact, that's what they asked me for. How many years did she borrow? So that's going to be time. So let me go ahead and clean this up for you. And now I'm going to solve. So here we're going to go ahead and multiply 500 times 300, which would give us 15. The next step to solve for t, since this means 15 times t, I'm going to have to divide both sides by 15, which is going to give us t equals 6. Now, since t is measured in years, I would go ahead and answer that she borrowed it for 6 years. Now, from an earlier problem, we had this that said Paige deposited $1,500 in a savings account. How much interest will she earn after 3 years in an annual simple interest rate of 4%? So now what I'm trying to show you is we can use the equation that we just learned. Interest equals principal, which in this case was $1,500 because that's how much was deposited, times the rate, which was the 4%, times the time, which in this case was 3 years. Now, if you multiply this all together, we would get 180. Now, if you remember from the previous problem, that was the interest. She earned $180 in interest from her deposit. So this is one way for solving for interest. So the total interest for 3 years is $180. Number 5, Ben deposited $1,940 in a savings account at a yearly interest rate of 2%. He earned $310.40 in simple interest. How long did he have the money in the account? So first, what I'd like to do is start with the formula. Interest equals principal times rate times time. I'm going to go by each one to figure out what I know. Do I know how much interest he earned? I do. It was $310.40. Do I know how much was deposited or borrowed? The answer is yes. Ben deposited $1,940. Do I know the rate that he was given? I do. It was 2%, so I'm going to put 0.02. Do I know the time? The answer is no. In fact, that's what they're asking me. It says, how long did he have the money in the account? So I'm going to go ahead and leave that as T. So I'm going to now go ahead and clean this up for you real quick. Same numbers. I'm going to first simplify this by multiplying it, which is going to give us 38.8. Now to solve for t, this means 38.8 times t. So I'm going to do the inverse, which is divide both sides by 38.8. And that's going to leave me with 8 equals t. Now t is measured in years, so that would mean he had the money in for 8 years. Number 6, why don't you go ahead and pause the video and try this one by yourself. Number 6 says, Madison paid $2,910 worth of interest on her credit card during a 2-year period. The principal amount that she originally paid was $9,700. If the credit card charges simple interest, what was the simple interest rate that she paid? So once again, I'm going to start with interest equals principal times rate times time. And I'm going to go ahead and plug in the information that I know. I am going to say that I know the interest. Why? Because it says here Madison paid $2,910 worth of interest. So that is the interest. Do I know the principal? The answer is yes. The principal amount that she originally paid was $9,700. So that's going to go in for the principal. Do I know the rate that she was charged? The answer is no. So for that reason, I'm going to keep R as R. That's what I'm essentially solving for. And I know this because it says, what is the interest rate? Now, do I know how long, in this case, that she kept this on her credit card? The answer is yes, she kept it for 2 years. So we're going to go ahead and replace T with a 2, just like that. So notice I'm going step by step. I'm plugging in what I know. And here, since they're asking me for the interest rate, I am solving for R. So once again, let me go ahead and clean this up for you. So what we're going to do now is simplify the 9,700 times 2, which is going to give us 19,400 times R. Now, since this means multiplication, I'm going to do the inverse and divide both sides by 19,400. This is going to cross cancel, and once you divide this, we are going to be left with, technically, if you divide this, you would get 0.15. But since it's a rate, we are looking for a percentage. We would convert that into a percent by moving it 2 to the right, and that's how we ended up with 15%. Okay, number 7, it says John paid $1,184 worth of interest on his credit card during a 2-year period. If the interest paid is simple interest and at a rate of 16%, what was the principal amount he originally put on his credit card? Assume he did not put any more items on the card. Why don't you go ahead and pause the video and try this one by yourself. Okay, so let's see how well we did. Using the equation interest equals principal times rate times time, hopefully you said the interest was $1,184. The principal we do not know, so we're going to leave it as a P. We do know the rate is 16%, so we're going to convert that to a decimal, so 0.16. And we do also know the time, which is 2 years. We're going to simplify that by multiplying these two, leaving us with 1,184 equals 3,200 times P. So to solve for P, we're going to divide both sides by 3,200, and that's going to leave us with $3,700. So since that equals P, that means John originally spent $3,700 on his credit card. Well, guess what? That concludes the lesson for today. Thank you so much for tuning in, and as always, until next time, bye.